London, started to have children. Here he is with his first child, William, in 1842. Then in 1842, he bought Down House and they moved out to Kent. So they moved out of London society to this home in Kent at that time. In 1842, he put down all of his ideas about evolution and about natural selection into a manuscript called The Foundations of the Origin of Species. He called it a sketch, written in 1842. This was never published. Okay? He said he told his wife she could publish it if he died, but it was really just his practice, if you will, of writing down these ideas. And I mention this again because the creationists are trying to make a big deal about how Darwin was actually scooped by somebody else. We'll talk about Wallace in a very short time. And that this idea wasn't his. And clearly it was. This is 1842. This is 20 years earlier, 20 years before he actually published his Origin. He had the essence all written down in this sketch, in this notebook. And then he was planning on writing a very much larger volume where he explained evolution, he explained natural selection. Meanwhile, though, he worked on barnacles. So Darwin became famous at this time. This is the early 1850s. Became famous for his massive study of barnacles. He published 3 books. Here's 2 of them on barnacles, fossil barnacles, varieties of barnacles, showing clearly, I don't know how many of you know what barnacles look like, but they're crustaceans. They're related to lobsters. Okay? And the only way you know that is by looking at the larval forms of barnacles. So one of the things that Darwin did was demonstrate that these are actually crustaceans, highly modified crustaceans. So he became quite famous for this very detailed work, which he realized was crucial, not only to his reputation as a scientist, but also to demonstrate that he was capable of looking at things in detail. Right? Because remember, he's about to publish something which is a really big picture kind of science, right? He wants to establish that he's up there with the best of them when it comes to focusing narrowly on something for a long period of time, in this case 4 years. So this is the Darwin who's about to write Origin of Species. This is what he looked like. And he did not look like this guy with the beard and whatever. That's much later. This is Darwin, the intellectual, Darwin the scientist, Darwin who walks with Hensel still, who has many friends in the London community. People who visit him at Down House all the time. In 1858, he's working on the big book. He's working on a book that will explain 2 things. It will explain that life evolves, that evolution happens, the argument in favor of evolution, and how it happens, namely by natural selection. So those are the 2 things that Darwin is putting together in this massive book that he's writing. And he's well into it when he gets a letter from an acquaintance, Alfred Wallace, who is working in Indonesia, on the islands of Indonesia, collecting various species, sending them back, and so he and Darwin have corresponded briefly. And Wallace sends him this letter outlining the essence of natural selection. Completely independently. Wallace didn't know, wasn't one of the insiders, he didn't know that Darwin was working on this. And of course Darwin didn't know that Wallace was thinking about it. And as Darwin says, he's really got a good part of the theory. Darwin's about to be scooped. His friends get together and say, look, no, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take Wallace's letter and we're going to present it to the Linnaean Society as a paper, but a joint paper with you, along with this excerpts from your previous writings establishing that you independently came up with this idea. So his friends published this letter on July 1st, 1858, on the tendency of species to form varieties, on the perpetuation of varieties and species by natural means of selection, by Darwin and Wallace. So that's how he handles the conflict. Nowadays, it would be joint back-to-back papers in nature, but this was a combined paper, and again, published by his friends. Darwin wasn't at this meeting. Right? And of course, Wallace was in Indonesia. Darwin was sick away, getting cured of something at this particular time. But this is a very famous incident in science. This is the origin of this idea that Wallace actually had the idea first and Darwin stole it from him. It's just simply not true. And Darwin didn't have to present a paper to the Linnaean Society from Wallace's letter. He could have ignored it. So it's a mark of Darwin's humility and fairness and sense of fairness that they published this paper together. But anyway, that's when Darwin decided that he better get to work on his book, and he would not be able to write a book, a huge book like he was planning on doing. Instead, he would write a précis, a pared-down version, okay? Only 450 pages instead of 2,000. So he got to work very hard, and by fall of the following year, so November 22nd, 1859, 150th anniversary this year, he publishes the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The printer made 1,250 copies, and they were sold out on the first day. So there were these stories that you just have to tell when you're talking about Darwin. The truth of the matter is, he had pre-sold them, so he knew exactly how many to make in order to sell out the copies, because it was a big deal to say you sold out your first print run on the first day. More truth, 1,250 copies, drop in the buckets. Dickens was selling tens of thousands of copies every month. Okay? So it was popular for a book of its kind. But let's not get carried away about about just how popular it was. Read by everybody who counted. But don't get this image in your mind of the masses of people in the London streets walking around carrying this green book, reading it. That's really not what happened. It was read by a very select group of people who happened to be high. This is Victorian England, right? So the country was run by a relatively small clique, and they're the ones that read it. So what does he say in Origin of Species? He's saying two things. He's making the case for evolution. He's making the case that species were not separately created. They evolved over time. And he has an explanation for how this could happen. His explanation is natural selection. So those are the two things that he's rightly famous for. Let's just briefly go through the chapters. And I apologize for those of you who have read the book. I can give you the 5-minute précis, okay? So just bear with me. Chapter 1, he talks about variation under domestication. He uses pigeons. Here's a bunch of different pieces. This is all the same species. These are varieties of pigeons. He talks about cattle, dogs, things that we're all very familiar with. He says, these are all the same species, but they're varieties. And what's special about varieties? Well, varieties are incipient species. Over a long period of time, those varieties are going to reach a point where they can no longer interbreed and they will become species. And so what we see, albeit under domestication, this is selected by humans, okay, is formation of varieties that can look very, very different. And they